My name is Claire, and I'm a thoracic surgeon. A few years ago, I became a fully licensed doctor at the hospital. Usually, every doctor has at least one night shift per week. That night was only my second time working overnight. The chief physician met me and gave me a list of tasks for the night. Our hospital has many patients undergoing treatment and many waiting for surgery. I had to check on them during the night and set up IV drips with medication. Sometimes we also get emergency patients brought in after car accidents, since there's always a surgeon on duty at our hospital. As I began checking on the patients, one of them caught my full attention. This man was paralyzed and in critical condition. Everyone understood he didn't have much time left. Inoperable stage 4 cancer. His heart and liver were filled with metastases. I entered his room to give him some painkillers. He was sleeping, but moaning in pain. It was a horrible sight. He was alone in the room because the other patients couldn't sleep next to him. I gave him an injection to relieve his pain, and after a minute, he seemed to feel better. I stayed in the room a little longer. He seemed to fall into a deep sleep, so I decided to continue checking on the rest of the patients. As I began to get up from the chair, the man suddenly grabbed my hand. His eyes were open and he was trying to say something to me. He squeezed my hand so tightly that I started to feel pain. When he let go, he immediately closed his eyes and fell asleep again. I checked his pulse. It was very high. It was incredibly unsettling. I stepped out into the hospital hallway and took a deep breath. All right, I had to go see the other patients. But even then, I kept thinking about what he was trying to tell me. There was no one in the nearby rooms. The next patient was at the end of the hallway. I walked up to him and asked why he wasn't sleeping. The man was staring out the window and told me it was a strange night. On nights like this, he couldn't fall asleep. I asked if he needed anything to help him sleep. He didn't respond. Another patient acting strange. Fine. Time to check on Maggie, a woman I had operated on a few days ago. The window in her room was open, and I closed it right away. Maggie said she didn't give me permission to close it. She was clearly in a bad mood, although she's usually very friendly. I set up a new IV for her and wished her a good night, but Maggie turned away and didn't say a word back. I was starting to feel uneasy that all the patients were acting so strangely. The image of the man who grabbed my hand kept coming back to me. That's where it all started. When I found myself back in the dark hospital hallway, the place suddenly felt completely different. It felt heavy. I didn't want to be there anymore, but I had to do my job. The next 3 patients were asleep, and I simply changed their IVs. I went to the doctor's break room and made myself some coffee. Most of the night's tasks were done so I could rest a little. I fell asleep on the couch for about an hour when suddenly I was awakened by the sound of the phone ringing. The on-duty nurse called me and said I needed to come to room 315 immediately. That was the room of the same man. I stepped into the hallway and once again felt the eerie atmosphere of the hospital at night. I had to go up to the 3rd floor. Why did the nurse decide to check on that patient? It wasn't part of her responsibilities. I went up to the 3rd floor, and when I turned toward the hallway, my heart nearly stopped. At the end of the corridor stood a man. It was the patient from room 315. He was standing completely still. I slowly walked up to him and asked what he was doing there. Silence. I placed my hand on his shoulder and he suddenly turned around, startling me again. His face was filled with terror, and he couldn't speak, though he was clearly trying. I brought him back to the room and laid him down on the bed. The IV needle was lying on the bed. I needed to put it back into his vein, but he stopped me. With all his body language, he was showing that I shouldn't do it. At that moment, all I could think about was where the nurse had gone. I needed help because the patient was resisting. He held my hand tightly, but I managed to pull away. I went out into the hallway to find the nurse, but she was nowhere to be found. When I returned to the room, there was another patient standing next to the man. He turned to me and said, "It's over." I ran to the bed and saw that the man had stopped breathing. I began CPR, but I knew it was useless. I thought to myself that it really was the end. But what was the patient from room 314 doing there? When I turned around, he was gone. I went downstairs and found the nurse. Together we documented what happened and locked the room. I felt very sad because I understood that this patient didn't want to live. Maybe for him it was a relief. I was sitting and drinking coffee when I remembered I needed to check room 314. I wanted to find out what that patient was doing in someone else's room during the night. At 5 a.m., I opened the door and entered room 314. That was the creepiest moment of the whole shift. The room was empty. The bed was made, no personal belongings, not even a distinct smell. It was as if no one had ever stayed there. That couldn't be. I checked, and it turned out the man from that room had been discharged 9 days ago. There was no mistake. How did he get into the hospital at night, and how did he vanish? There were no security cameras in that corridor. The windows were shut, and there was security downstairs. And what was he doing in room 315? That's the one question that still haunts me to this day. Hi everyone, my name is Alex. This story happened to me during the pandemic a few years ago. I remember how sick I got. I had a fever and body aches for an entire week, a strong dry cough that got worse every day, and of course, it was hard to breathe. I got tested, and it came back positive. Since my condition wasn't improving, they admitted me to a special hospital, to the infectious disease unit. I didn't even bring any of my things with me, just my phone and documents. They brought me in at night and placed me in a room with an old man. The room smelled awful, but it was forbidden to open the window. The man smelled like bodily waste. They gave me antibiotics and told me the doctor would come in the morning. I was supposed to get some sleep, but because of the fever, I couldn't even lie still. Plus, the smell was unbearable. I turned to the wall and tried to cover my nose with my t-shirt, but it barely helped. After a couple of hours, the medicine started working, and I fell asleep. It's hard to even call it sleep. I was in some kind of delirium, not even sure if I was asleep or awake. At some point, I woke up to a noise in the room. I turned onto my other side and tried to open my eyes. It was very dark and cold, and the smell had gotten even stronger. It seemed the old man had used the bathroom. Disgusting, I thought. The old man kept lying in his bed, stinking. I turned away and tried to fall asleep, but it was impossible. I'd have to go into the hallway and call a nurse. I opened the door and stepped out into the dark hospital corridor. It was quiet, and it felt like there was no one else in the hospital but me and that old man. I walked a bit forward and realized I could get lost in these corridors. I didn't even know where to go. This hospital was huge. Still, I figured there had to be doctors nearby. Otherwise, what's the point of this place? I walked a bit further and turned right. Another long corridor. This place was a damn maze, not a hospital. In my condition, even walking was hard, let alone remembering directions. I went back to the room and realized I'd have to suffer until morning. But when I returned, I noticed a button next to my bed. I pressed it, and within 2 minutes, a nurse arrived. I told her I couldn't stay there any longer, but there were no other rooms available. Strange that in such a massive hospital, there were no free rooms. It felt to me like the whole place was empty. I asked her to do something about the old man and the smell, but she refused to do that too. She wasn't going to clean him up by herself, or just didn't want to deal with it. I'd have to wait until morning. That night felt like the longest of my life. I kept tossing and turning, not knowing where to hide my head. On top of that, I was constantly sweating and then freezing. Finally, I managed to fall asleep. Again, I had some kind of crazy dream. I saw an old house in a dark forest, and someone was watching me from the window. I suddenly woke up and felt a strange sense of fear. Was this a panic attack? I looked over at the old man. He wasn't asleep. He was sitting on his bed, staring straight ahead. What was he doing? Maybe he wasn't in his right mind. Suddenly he looked at me. I got scared and turned onto my side. The creepy old man lay back down. I heard his old mattress creaking. I had to try to sleep again, and I managed to do it. Once more, I found myself in a nightmare. Again that house, and the person watching me from the window. Who was this observer? A figment of my imagination or a real person? It all felt very real. I got closer to the house, and suddenly I felt someone approaching me from behind. I woke up. I couldn't move. I was just lying there on my back. Damn, what's happening to me? I could only move my eyes, and as I looked around, I saw him again. The old man was standing by his bed, staring at me. I felt horrible, scared, and anxious. I closed my eyes and tried to move. My hands slowly lifted off the bed, and I was able to snap out of it. I looked at the old man. He was lying in bed. I felt awful and immediately fell asleep. I was back at that house, standing on the doorstep, reaching for the doorknob. The sense of anxiety was overwhelming. Everything around me seemed to dim and tremble from the emotional tension. The door creaked open, and darkness seemed to engulf me. Fear. A deep, intense fear. And I woke up again. I opened my eyes and once more couldn't move. It felt like something invisible but incredibly heavy was about to crush me. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw someone standing next to me. It was him, the old man. I couldn't turn my head to look at him. There was this feeling that if I did, I would die instantly. I lay there for what felt like a minute, and then shut my eyes again. It took all my strength to open them once more. There was no one next to me. The old man was lying in his bed, and outside the window, it was already light. Damn, thank God that night was over. I was in terrible shape, and when the doctor came in, he told me it was sleep paralysis. I felt a bit better and hoped nothing like that would ever happen to me again. I had to leave the room to go get some tests done. I got out of bed, walked to the door, and stopped. I turned around and looked at the old man. He was staring at me with a look that gave me chills. I stepped out of the room and started thinking, what really happened that night? Hi, my name is David, and I work as a night security guard at an old abandoned hospital. The building was supposed to be renovated, but until that happened, I was responsible for guarding it. I worked practically without any days off, only occasionally getting replaced by Bob, a guard from another hospital. I spent almost a year working there, and I nearly lost my mind. Now I see that hospital in my dreams, and I don't know how to get it out of my head. It all started on the very first night of my shift. I came to work thinking I'd just sit in the security room and relax. The job seemed really easy, but I was wrong. I unpacked my things, tidied up the work area, and sat down at the desk. The cameras were off, which meant I had to find the generator and turn them on. The building had several generators, and they brought me fuel twice a week. On the first day, I didn't know that, so I went looking for where I could turn on the electricity. The building was big, but I needed to check the first floor and maybe the basement. On the first floor, there were several old offices and the chief doctor's office. Everything was abandoned, of course. Lots of trash everywhere. The morgue was also on the first floor. That place was probably the creepiest part of the building. Or so I thought, until I went up to the second floor where there were a lot of old hospital rooms, all with their doors wide open. It felt like the patients had suddenly left everything behind and just walked out. I found a generator on each floor and realized I'd have to power them up myself. An hour had already passed, and I hadn't even sat down yet. I thought security guards just sat on chairs all night. I started looking for fuel for the generators. The basement was very dark and dirty. The pipes in the walls creaked and made really eerie noises. My flashlight was the only source of light, and honestly, I could barely see anything in those long hallways. I kept having to turn around to check behind me. Rats scurried across the floor, and even though I knew they weren't a real threat, I still kept looking over my shoulder. The atmosphere down there was creepy. Why did I even think the generator fuel would be there? I went outside and saw that there were fuel cans stored under a canopy. What an idiot I was. I filled up all the generators and turned on the power. The cameras started working, and the lights came on in my office on the first floor. I could even watch TV. That's how my first night shift ended. Very soon, I got used to the strange noises and the constant darkness. The trash and the state of decay didn't bother me anymore. I just did my job. That went on for 10 months. Now I realize that over that time, I changed a lot. I became very lazy, lost my alertness, and turned kind of emotionless. That place affected me more than I ever imagined. Living in that kind of atmosphere for such a long period of time, definitely not the best idea. One day, I was waiting for the guy who usually brought me fuel. I normally met him at the gate, but this time I didn't feel like going outside. I just opened the gate remotely and planned to close it in the morning. At 3 a.m., I woke up and realized I had fallen asleep right at my workstation. That had never happened to me before, and I knew I had to change my attitude toward the job. But I left out one important detail. I didn't say what woke me up. I heard the creak of an old door that hadn't been opened in about 20 years. The sound was like someone was inside the building, or maybe I just dreamed it. I didn't know at the time what it was, so I decided to check. That's how I wanted to start changing my approach to the job. I decided to inspect the whole first floor, but the generator wasn't working. I'd have to go outside and bring in some fuel. But when I stepped out, I realized there was no fuel. Damn, did he not deliver it? That had never happened before. I closed the gate and went back inside. I had to use my flashlight. It felt like I was right back on my first night shift. I walked down the dark hallways, trying to figure out what that sound was. Maybe some teenagers had snuck in and I'd have to chase them out. Or maybe it was a wild raccoon. I checked the entire first floor, but all the doors were locked. Except for one, the morgue. I had never gone in there. The door was slightly open, and honestly, I was creeped out. I didn't want to go in, but I had to check. The door was hard to open. It was dark inside. Is anyone here? Only my echo answered. All right, I must have dreamed it. I went back to the room and sat in my chair. A few days later, I had already forgotten about the incident, but soon I heard a strange noise again. It sounded like footsteps. I kept hearing those noises, but I never found anyone. Maybe I just didn't want to find anyone. But I know for sure that from that day on, I constantly felt like I wasn't alone in there. I became afraid to leave my room at night. Eventually, I stopped going up to the other floors of the building. The atmosphere of that abandoned hospital was wearing down my nerves. I felt like the place was draining the life out of me, and I had already started thinking about quitting. One night I was watching TV when I suddenly caught a bright light out of the corner of my eye on one of the security cameras. It was the second floor, my least favorite floor in the whole hospital, because that's where the patient rooms were. I had to go up there, but my gut told me not to. I grabbed my flashlight and went up to the second floor. The generator had fuel, but I couldn't get it to start. That place was the creepiest I had ever seen. I pointed my flashlight down the hallway and saw someone standing by the window. I froze. It felt like I was in a nightmare, and any second I'd wake up. That place had finally broken me, and my brain refused to think rationally. I started walking forward, like I was in a trance, and that's when my flashlight went out. That actually helped snap me out of it, and as I fumbled to turn the flashlight back on, I realized I had to think clearly. The flashlight worked again, but there was no one at the end of the hallway. Had I gone insane? I checked the open hospital rooms but didn't find anything unusual. When I got back to the security room, I immediately wrote down what had happened in my notebook. At that moment, I already knew that was going to be my last night there. There was no way I would ever come back, and I didn't care about the paycheck. I waited until morning and called my boss. He was disappointed to hear he'd have to find a new guard. I returned the keys and went home. For many nights after that, I couldn't sleep in my own bed. Every night I'd wake up as if I were back in that hospital. I know no one ever worked there after me. They decided to demolish the building. I'll never know what I saw that night. And honestly, I don't want to.